South Africa actually experienced 50 billion rand loss to its economy, and 150,000 people were left jobless. Nearing the end of these 8 days, South Africa was still trying to make sense of what had just happened. Although news reports had been consistent and up to date, we needed to have this comprehensive overview of how the riots unfolded from KZN to Gauteng, and really how planned this all was. I did this story, and how I did the story, I'll explain to you now. But I do believe that this is an approach that can be used for other protests, but also issues that are sort of related to each other. Like crime, for example, South Africa has a high number of cash in transit heists and a high number of kidnappings. And so I think it would be also interesting to maybe apply this method to those issues, but you can also use it for, service delivery protests, which South Africa also experiences quite often. And I think it's a good way to sort of give that bird's eye view. So once the dust settled on the July riots, News 24 investigations team got together to see how we could answer at least some of the questions that our readers still had, and give a bird's eye view of the unrest, but also interpret for our readers what had happened in these devastating 8 days. So I started to gather as much data, and specifically location data, of where these incidents of violence and riots took place. And I wanted to create a map that would pinpoint in a chronological time lapse where incidents of unrest and looting took place, when, and what happened. And so in the end, we had a map that could not only tell you how rioters mobilized to populate key infrastructure and transport areas in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, but also just how planned the operation was. So I used quite a few data sources. The primary one, I would say, it was News 24 communication. And this is what you can see here. I just posted a WhatsApp from my colleague, Jeff Wicks. And Jeff and other people in our newsroom would get tip-offs from people on the ground and from their sources saying, this is happening in my area. This is just started happening in my area, looting, violence. And my colleagues would collate the information for me very kindly, like Jeff has done here. Once I had these locations, I then trawled through social media, official press statements, and communication from government organizations to try and find more locations and to try and find dates and times. And then over about 3 weeks, trawling through social media to get a very, very rough timestamp. And it was helpful because you could see people saying, this mall is just starting to be looted. I can see people walking in here. And then a few days later, somebody would post, is it okay to go there? Is it safe? Are cleanup operations happening? And so it was really up to date and very helpful. It is open source though. So there was a lot of fake news and people who, I don't know, just wanted to cause chaos. So it was quite difficult to check the veracity of these posts. But I did that by checking against news reports, people on the ground, and official communication. So you do have to sift through the rubbish, basically. And then after I had gathered my data, I was alerted to the Institute for Security Studies, who are undertaking the same project or exercise that I was doing. Now, the ISS has a crime hub, and I spoke to the head of that crime hub, Lizette Lancaster, and we decided to partner on the project and share our data with each other. And in these projects, talking to independent institutions like the Institute for Security Studies is really important because they can educate you and share information with you like this. And they have very trusted, experienced experts who can help you. So in the end, I had about over 200 locations where violence and looting took place in South Africa during these 8 days. And then it was very rough data, and it needed to be cleaned up and then tweaked slightly to essentially turn it into a map. So I worked with News 24's data guy, Andrew Fraser, and I really think in this day and age, it's really important for newsrooms to have data people on their team, because the possibilities with having an expert like that in terms of stories and what you can do, it's just endless. So Andrew helped me clean up this data, and then our graphics guy, Rudy Lowe, helped me to essentially create this map. So I want to show you a preview just very quickly of the map. Can you see that? You can see the map, okay. So in the end, we had this map, which it starts from the 4th of July and it ends on the 19th of July. And so you can see that using red dots, it shows you how the protest spread over time, but it's obviously not exhaustive. So it includes locations, not only locations, but as you can just see, tweets of people who might have encouraged riots, or those who were in influence at the time who were tweeting about the riots, just to give some context. If you click on a dot also, you can see, you'll also be able to see additional information, but we decided to just keep the red dots and minimal information, because we felt that the unfolding of these red dots tells a bigger story than just telling you what happened in those 8 days. So what the map tells us is that the planning at first, the riots and the violence was at first a tactical and thought out plan. If you go back, you can see that the N2 and the N3 in Durban were the first ports of call to be populated. Now, these are key infrastructure transport routes, transporting about a lot of South Africa's cargo and supplies, and actually blocking these routes with burning trucks, with sand and tar, so that cargo trucks couldn't pass. It actually led to a very temporary fuel shortage in South Africa, at which point fuel trucks had to be transported by police for safety. So we can see that, it populates these key highways. It then spreads to the central business districts in Durban, which then allowed mass looting of shops to start. Then we can see how it spreads into the city, and then the Mooi River Toll Plaza, and there it is hitting Gauteng over here. And by 10 July, when it hit Gauteng, we can see how violence and looting escalates. But here we go from 12th July, where we're at now. We can see how things actually start to fall apart. And we can see how rioters and instigators, look at that explosion of red dots. We can see how instigators of unrest lost control. And it sort of just became a free-for-all with these random dots appearing everywhere without any organization. The plan to shut down South Africa had really lost control and to opportunism, really. General people just sort of looting stores, trying to take as much as they could. It was the height of violence. 15 people died in this time, dozens were arrested. Let me go back to my PowerPoint. This story revealed that the blockades on the N2 and the N3, as I said, were the first ports of calls. And experts, speaking to experts, which you should do for data stories, but collaborating with experts is really important in this sense. But speaking to experts, the motivation for blocking these key highways was probably twofold, in that it hampered the police's penetration into certain areas, and sort of chokeholding the ability to reinforce ranks. And then the second is that the police effectively, rendered useless, you could ensure maximum economic impact by shutting down freight routes to trade. That's just an example of the map. So that's just what the map can tell you at face value. But when you start to look at specific locations and you have a sort of historical understanding of these locations, you can see that most hotspots in the unrest were actually already areas of political contestation. These were areas where South Africa had seen service delivery protests before. Much of them were instigated by political opportunism. So that's, for example, Reservoir Hills, Greytown in Durban, Alex in Joburg. These have had persistent protests in the past and were mobilized during the unrest. But then when you look at what was not hit by violence, you can see that while many of these sites were areas of political contestation and went on to cause chaos, many of the locations didn't. And this is an indication that, while so much devastation occurred and so many people died in just such a short space of time, the riots were actually a failure. What started with blocking key highways and the burning of critical infrastructure by Zuma supporters had turned into something else entirely. As one expert put it, I'll just add, is that they didn't expect the resilience of the South African people. But in conclusion, data journalism is a really excellent way to expose injustice and add a wider context to something that's widespread and related. It can help shine a light on the experiences of marginalized people, or in this case, devastation. And I put up this map here to just add another example of the power that this kind of journalism can have. And this is a picture, a graphic made by a man called Alex Smith. He's an American who just likes to do maps. And he created this map of the George Floyd protests and where around the world they were taking place. So he collected hundreds of data points and created this powerful image, which really shows how solidarity in a cause or an experience and an experience of injustice can transgress borders. Social media has also become an effective tool for gathering information from multiple different places when journalists simply cannot be everywhere at once. So as long as posts are corroborated and from trusted sources, it can greatly assist to bolster data stories. While it's still important to provide the personal perspective in protest reporting, this kind of visual data journalism can draw from time and visual evidence to bolster these testimonies, show a pattern or a break in a pattern, which can inform or challenge our understanding of an issue.
Thanks, Azzarah. That's great. I think we'll ask a couple of questions after all the panelists have spoken, but certainly it is a way of going beyond just that initial hard news story, rushing to a protest, covering that, but then what next? So thanks for that. All right,
Thanks.
So our next speaker is Halima Athumani. Now, Halima has been a freelance broadcast journalist for more than a decade. She's covered politics, health, human rights, and social affairs. She's worked as a news anchor and reporter for local radio stations in Uganda, and she's done investigative stories for television, including one on Uganda's health pyramid that was aired on Al Jazeera. She's also handled special assignments for Public Radio International and BBC, among others. Halima is currently a correspondent for Voice of America, and she's based in Kampala. Her work's also been published in SciDevNet and the Washington Post. And I guess we all know that covering protests can be dangerous, right? You just heard earlier when I said, Azzarah can testify to that. the Committee to Protect Journalists has actually documented numerous cases of journalists who have either been killed on assignment covering protests. And I think here, for example, of a Nigerian journalist, Precious Owolabi, from Channels TV. He was killed covering a confrontation between Shiite Muslims and police in July 2019. And CPJ has also documented numerous cases of journalists being assaulted, arrested, intimidated, and attacked for simply doing their jobs covering protests. And Halima herself has actually reported on this in connection to Ugandan journalists. So in May this year, for example, just ahead of the World Press Freedom Day, VOA published her article about how Ugandan journalists face physical danger while doing their jobs. And one of the things that struck me was there was some data from the Uganda Human Rights Network for journalists that Halima actually referred to in that story, where she said that between, I think it was November, when it was just ahead of the elections. So when candidates were being nominated, and between the actual elections itself in January, there were actually over 100 journalists that were beaten during the course of their work. And so when we talk about covering protests, of course, the whole issue is that you need to be able to cover the protests without being killed or assaulted in the first place. And that is why safety of journalists is just so important. And this is why Halima has chosen this topic. And she's going to share with us how we as journalists out in the field covering protests can protect ourselves. So thank you so much, Halima. Over to you.
Okay. All right. I think from now on. Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Good. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Halima Athumani, as Angela just introduced me, and I am based in Kampala, Uganda. I think to discuss our safety as journalists in Uganda, if we want to understand how journalists form themselves in the middle of violence, I think this starts way back from 2018. And this was the time, this was just around August of 2018, we had a by-election in Uganda. And in this by-election, the current president of the National Unity Party, who is Bobby Wine, at that time he had not been confirmed as a presidential candidate. So he was going around the country supporting different politicians. And in Arua in particular, which is in northern Uganda, President Museveni had also gone there to support or to show support to the candidate who was standing for the ruling National Resistance Movement. So in the night, one of these nights, there was an attack, a raid on a hotel where Bobi Wine was staying, and the reason for this raid was that there were reports that one of the president's car had been hit by a stone. And because of this, I think there were about 80 people who had been arrested for using this one stone. But then during that night, we had journalists from our local media houses who went to cover this event. And what happened, they had gone to actually cover the by-election. No one knew, things were going to go around, and all of a sudden we're going to have people being beaten and killed. So what happens was that one of these journalists was actually on air, live on air. He works for NTV, it's called Habadzwa. And during that time, a military officer came and, just dragged him off the TV, off the camera. And, before we know it, Ziwa was spending a night in prison. So that was just the culmination or the start of the violence towards the 2021 general elections, which was early this year. Now, one of the photos that I think I was supposed to use was of a journalist. Again, just a few, I think that was in August, June, July, around September again. I think that was the time when Bobi Wine again had been taken, was just returning back from South Africa. And at this time, he was, so all of a sudden they said, he was not being allowed to leave the country. Then there was violence that erupted in town. No one knew what was happening. To be honest with you, myself, I was actually at a salon. It was just a few days to Eid. I was preparing to go home with my bag, in hand. There was nothing to do. It had I didn't carry a recorder. I was not completely prepared for this day. All of a sudden I hear, blasts going on. I get out, and then the saloon was closing. I said, what's going on? I said, oh, they're shooting at people. So I ran out of the saloon, and then what do I see? The whole streets are a mess. So I get my phone and I'm recording. And, by that time, the police had cut out so many roads in town. One of the most notorious roads that we have in town is called Nasa Road lately. And every time protests start, this is where you find that most times there'll be burning of tires, there'll be burning of anything, of rubbish, whatever people would get, they'll just throw in the road and burn. And that's when the police come in, the military come in. So what normally happens is that every time a protest happens in Uganda, so the security is not only going to depend on police, they are going to deploy what we call the military police. And here in Uganda, as journalists, we always say, when you see a military police officer, the only thing you need to do is obey. If a military police officer gets you recording something and says delete, please delete, because once they get a hold of you, you do not know what's going to happen to you between the next couple of minutes. So I know we always say that most times when protests happen, we never know. And we never know if they're going to happen. But one thing that I always tell myself is that you can always use 5 to 10 minutes to find out what kind of environment you are going to, who you're going to meet, like what is happening. If you make a few phone calls, that will help you. Irene, if you could just go back to my words, I think. Yeah, a little. Yes, please. And sometimes the protest can find you at the scene. How you act and decide to move has to be a personal decision. Above all, remember, you have to ensure your safety. If you can scroll down, Irene, I remember that after the elections, what journalists decided to do, if you see this photo, this was not a photo where you would say that that day when we went to cover this press conference, Bobi Wine had gone to the Electoral Commission offices, and here he was just coming to petition the Electoral Commission, tell them, listen to me, I have queries. But as you can see, journalists were wearing, they were wearing helmets, they were wearing I can't call them really bulletproof vests at the time, but maybe stab vests, So that is how bad the situation had gotten, because every time journalists were out, we never really would know. And this was inside. I think there was another photo that I was supposed to share in with what was happening on the outside. Roads had been blocked. And you know, and that just was the situation. You just would never know what you're going to face, and that is the danger of going in to report these protests. So you always have to try, spend a few minutes, 3 or 5 minutes, just call around. If there's a colleague, we always have TV stations, I'm sure in many countries, you find that there are those that would love to report at a scene. They're always there earlier than others. If you can try and call someone just to ask them what's going on, that way it gives you some time to prepare. Now, this second photo, this is, as you can see, this is a journalist. And he's a former photojournalist for Reuters. It's called James Akena. This was the day actually when I said I was at the salon. And so journalists were in different places. Some of us were at the back road, and then James decided, I think, to just go his own way. And while there, this is what happens. So this is the military. Sometimes we call them special forces because we know, you know, when you get out of the field as a journalist, time comes, you get to start differentiating who is wearing what uniform. So these were special forces deployed to go and control the protests. It didn't matter. Clearly, James had his camera. If this photograph was much more clearer, he had his camera, you know, up. He was holding and screaming, "I'm a journalist, I'm a journalist." But as you can see, this soldier on the left, you know, he just kept hitting at him. And eventually, you know, he ended up being hospitalized for quite a period. So yes, violence sometimes is anticipated. So we need to talk in. For me, I always say, before you go out to the field, let someone know where you're going. You know, try to do not work alone if possible. Always stay in groups. We always, in journalism, always say there's safety numbers. So try and make sure if you're alone, try and find other journalists. Once officers or security officers are able to identify who you are, then that actually helps you. So here in Uganda, what we do sometimes, for example, the association that I am a member of, which is the Foreign Correspondents Association, when we are printing cards, we try and print these large lanyard cards. That way, if a security officer, because by the time a security officer is coming to hit you, they're probably going to come close. So the best thing that you need to do is, you know, just flash your lanyard, make sure the press word is seen, even if from a distance. But what we have also come to learn in Uganda is that sometimes is not going to save you. So depending on what orders the security officers have, this may not save you. Sometimes they are sent to cover up. So for example, when Akena was hit, it was very clear they did not want any journalists, you know, covering what was going on. And also the fact that, you know, he was disadvantaged that he was alone. All these other journalists were somewhere else. So him being alone, that gave them an opportunity, you know, to hit him. Little did they know that there was also another journalist, you know, right by the back who was taking this photo. As I said earlier, many times when we get out, we never know where we're going. So when you hear, you know, a protest, the first thing you do is, you know, carry your bag, carry your camera, carry your recorder, and then you forget that, you know, when protests happen, the bullet is not going to, when a soldier decides to use his gun, that gun is not necessarily going to go out and say, oh, this is a journalist, I'm going to discriminate, so I will have to hit the protester. You are a human being, you are right there. So you need to know that, you know, I know that there are people who say and argue that in civilized or in professional army or security organizations, they have particular ways in which they will have to, for example, fire tear gas. Many times they also will fire it in the air. In Uganda, they are firing it right into people, you know, and this also includes journalists. So, and this we had, I think I read there were like 2 cases during the election, during the campaign period. One was a local journalist, another one was a foreign journalist. The local journalist was walking, and this police officer just shot at him and just shouted collateral damage. For the foreign journalist, she was also just walking away, and the police officer said, "What are you doing here, you mzungu?" And before she knew it, he hit her. I mean, he hit her with the rubber bullet on the foot. So sometimes this doesn't help, but having protective gear, I know we don't have protective gear that is going to cover your whole body, but there are places that you can try and save. Your head, for example, you definitely are going to need it, your chest to cover all of your body organs. In other countries, for example, in Uganda, during election periods, that I think is the period when, as journalists, we realize that we do not have enough protective gear. This is not a country where you're going to go to some shop in town and buy a gas mask and buy a bulletproof vest or a helmet. And even just bringing them in always causes, raises eyebrows with security. Why are they bringing in these gear and all of that? So in some countries, if you're lucky, you may actually get some, stab vests. You may get first aid kits. Here we are always depending on Red Cross, to come and give us first aid. But when you're going out when you're going out to cover a protest, make sure you also have to include, good boots. I do have boots, so at least I know I'm a little bit covered, but I know it won't still save me. But do remember that, none of this is going to save you from a bullet. Once it comes, it's come. And also these guys, they target. And when they target, they're targeting a particular part of your body. But somehow, some of this gear will help. Exactly. So this photo, this is one of our members, of the association members, a local journalist who works for foreign media. So Moses Bwayo was a target for a while. Reason being that he was assigned to film a documentary covering Bobi Wine before elections and during elections and after elections. During this particular period, I was actually assigned to do the same thing. The only difference was that I was doing audio. So for my case, I would go to Bobi Wine's place during the weekends. So somehow I would find a way of covering up myself. But the reason why Moses became such a target was that he was visible. Every time you'd see Bobi Wine, you would see Moses. So with our police, any journalist who got close to Bobi Wine, that was enough to say, this person is pro Bobi Wine. Truth is, Moses was just doing his job. So after one of the press conferences, right at the National Unity Party platform presses, I think Moses was moving out and one of the police officers identified him and he just shot. Moses had a helmet on. Actually, he had a helmet on, he had a vest on, and he had a camera on. So what saved him, because this could have been worse. So what saved him was that when the rubber bullet was hit, it first hit his camera and then went and hit his cheek. So otherwise, we would not know if it was what would have happened if this was direct contact. So this just tells you how dangerous the field can be. In a split second, anything can happen to a journalist. Positioning and awareness. One thing that as journalists we need to do is we have to remain vigilant, continually assess where you are, what is developing around you. Avoid tunnel vision when reporting, where you sit in one place and think, I'm only going to report from this location. I don't know what's going to happen. As a journalist, you need to know, you need to monitor the red flags. If you see, police lining up, just know something is going to happen. Projectiles being thrown, tear gas being loaded. And what's funny is that the reason I think as to why journalists in Uganda sometimes take this for granted is that sometimes when things are still not so heated or when things go down, a police officer, and we always have these conversations when things have settled up a bit. Journalists come and say, oh, the guy came and say, hey, do you want me to show you what I can do? Can I give you a sample? And so he shoots in the air so that the journalists can capture that. But when things get worse, when things get out of hand, many times you find that these are the same people who are going to come around and target the journalists. So you need to know. So this photo here, where you see, these officers lined up, so there's police, the ones in the khaki uniform, and then the ones in green. This was the unit that we call the local defense unit. So these were set up a little before the elections, just to beef up police. So on this day, we had gone to cover a press conference at the media center. And this was just this was in January, a little before the NRM Day celebration. Because there were so many journalists who had been beaten during that period, before the elections, during the elections, journalists thought this is a time for us to, and you know, when they sent out the message, they said it was the head of, no, it was not the CD. Yes, the Chief of Defense Forces himself who was going to come and speak to journalists. So we thought this is a great time for us to go and speak to him, confront him and tell him, hey, we've had so many journalists being beaten. So why shouldn't we use this opportunity? So we get to the press conference, and then it turns out that they sent a police commissioner. So he speaks about the event, and then talks about, you know, how journalists have to cover and stuff. And then one journalist raises their hands up and says, we've been disrespected, we've been beaten, and we need you to apologize. And then, you know, there was a whole exchange. So we said, well, it seems we're not being respected. So we walk out. As we walked out, you know, some of us were tweeting and saying, this is what's happening. As soon as we stepped out of the Media Council offices, compound, we just saw police being, you know, sent in, and we're like, okay, I thought we just walked out. Why are they deploying against us? So you can see how it escalates so fast. Irene, if you could just go back, please. Yeah, right there. You know that, you know, it's just, you know, sorry. I mean, these things escalate so fast, so you never know what is going to happen the next minute. Before we knew it, aside from these guys who came on foot, there were about 15 motorcycles that had been deployed. There were 2 cell vans that had been deployed. I mean, these are journalists just walking out. So you can see the danger that, you know, some of these situations can pose. By the time they deployed, so that road is a two-way, but then we had them deployed on almost every side. Ask yourself, did we have escape routes? The only way we could escape is probably run back into the Media Council compound, and the gate was closed. So as a journalist, you also have to think about an evacuation plan. But your evacuation plan, is it going to be faster than a bullet? It won't. So it takes us back to the situational analysis, you know, knowing what to do, knowing, you know, just studying the environment around you when you're somewhere. Do know where you are and how you can get away. Who's picking you up? These are things that are important. Are you in touch with your editor? Is there any other journalist around who's going to hold your hand and say, let's run this way? These are things that you need to think about. Verbal de-escalation, learn how to speak to people. During the campaigns, if there was a video of this young journalist called Azzarah Karim, if you remember, if any of you had ever watched that, where so this young journalist was he was standing atop Bobi Wine's vehicle, so he was always filming too. And again, just like Moses, he became a target. He became one of those people that police knew, if we need to disable this young man. And during that period, the police landed on him. Yes, he was wearing a helmet. The first thing they did was take off the helmet, and then they started hitting him. The only thing that we probably think saved him or ensured that he was not killed, because first he was hit, and then they started spraying tear gas, pepper spray in his helmet. So I think then journalists started, he's a journalist. You know, there were screams from other journalists saying he's a journalist. And I think they kind of tried to back off, and that's how he was gotten into a car and taken away to safety. But, you know, it took him a couple of months to just recover. So sometimes the way we speak to the police, but also the public, because we just never know, you know, as I was saying earlier, that sometimes those days we used to think that, you know, as journalists would stand behind the police line and thought that was safe. But that's no longer safe, because the police are going to turn and hit at you. Sometimes you also think, if I run towards the public, that will be the safe area. That sometimes doesn't happen. I'm going to give you an example. I called it Lady Luck. So in 2018, again, when Bobi Wine was coming back from the airport, there were so many roadblocks that had been set up. And that was on the way to Entebbe. So no journalist was supposed to go towards Entebbe. People would come in, but also remember, lately we have 2 roads. We have the old road that is going to Entebbe and the express highway. So, and I had a colleague who was coming in from NPR, would come to cover the arrival of Bobi Wine, and he had slept in Entebbe, and we had to find ways of going to pick him up. So I get the drive, and then we use all these back roads. Unfortunately, there's a point where you would reach, and then there was a particular so the security went and set up a roadblock where, irrespective of which road you used, you would definitely be taken out. It was just near a radio station. And by around 11 a.m., there were so many journalists who had been stopped and were being held at that police station. So why do I say lady luck? As we got stopped by an officer on that same roadblock, I get a phone call from a friend. Luckily, it's unfortunate that we live in a country where sometimes the language that you speak could save you. So this officer comes, and then I pick up this phone, and my friend is speaking Swahili. And we know in Uganda, only soldiers speak Swahili. and they know that if anyone else is speaking Swahili, then maybe they are a member of security. So I'm like, hey, can I call you back? And I'm telling them, can I call you back? And I say that in Swahili. So this officer looks at me and said, Madam, where are you going? And I'm like, just a moment, officer. So I tell this guy, can I call you back? So he says, I think this one is one of ours. So please go ahead. So and that's what saved me. And then I had my boots on, remember, and here I was speaking Swahili. So that was just okay. I mean, and then I had on some of these, so I have some tour trousers too. So I think in a way they did not think a female journalist is from Uganda is going, and she's Ugandan. There's no way she's going to be speaking Swahili on the phone. There's no way she's going to dress up the way I did dress up. So how you dress up sometimes save you. How you speak sometimes may save you. And for me, that's what saved me that day. So we went in, we picked up our friend. We actually stayed around Entebbe, noticed and covered the deployment in Entebbe. By the time we drove out, we had a story to tell. You see, so sometimes it's lady luck. So how you dress up, how you speak sometimes, but also, just learning how to respect some of these security officers. I know many times they come to the field with all of this, all these orders, but just the way you speak to them can also sometimes de-escalate a situation that would have otherwise gone the wrong side. Then in the event that you find yourself, in the midst of gunshots, bullets, in one of the hostile environment trainings that I've had, they always say, kiss Mother Earth, because no one else is going to save you. So go down, get down and stay there until you are sure, that it is safe enough for you to start moving. Only then can you raise your head. Otherwise, if it's possible, stay down. If there are cases of snipers, for example, you may need to wait it out before running off. You can never be faster than a bullet. As they always say, a dead journalist does not tell a story.
Thank you very much, Halima. Indeed, a dead journalist cannot tell a story. I think it's certainly one of the things when I was reporting, we often just ran into a situation without taking the time to think things through. I mean, I recall being in Zimbabwe, and in the heat of the moment, as protesters were rushing out of a stadium, I was foolish enough to think that I could actually get into the stadium and push people out of my way. And it was only afterwards that I realized, wow, Angela, you're a fool. I mean, I could have been seriously hurt. And that's why I think when you started and you spoke about just taking some time out to think about things is always so important. There are just far too many journalists who have been killed or hurt in covering protests, and that's the one thing that we want to guard against. So thanks so much. As I'd said to you earlier, we had hoped that we would have had another panelist who would have spoken about the End SARS protests. What I will do for you, though, is I'm going to see whether there is something available that we can post on our app that will give you some idea, because I think what you would have heard was also alternative ways of covering things after protests. A protest doesn't necessarily end and you move on to the next thing. So I'll hopefully be able to do that. I've also got some reading material that will be of interest to you all. So please, when you have a chance, again, go to the app and have a look at the reading. I know that our next speaker is also going to make some suggestions about what you could read. So let's move on to our final speaker, and that's Sharif Abdel Kouddous. He's an editor of the independent and outspoken media outlet Madamas in Cairo. Before that, he was an independent journalist covering the region. His work has been published in The Nation, The Washington Post, The Los Angeles Times, Foreign Policy, Toronto Star, and elsewhere. He's also reported for a number of international media outlets as a TV correspondent. I think I should tell you that, Sharif was in Madame Assa's newsroom one Saturday in November 2019 with colleagues. It was a day after the editor Shadi Zalat was arrested and was being held incommunicado. If I recall, at the time, there was also an international TV crew that was present to witness what I call the jackboot tactics of the Egyptian security agents who had raided that outlet's offices for several hours. And they seized computers and phones. They forced some of the journalists to provide passwords to open their phones and laptops. And then they carted off the editor-in-chief, Lina Talla, who I think if you had attended the plenary session would have heard her speak, as well as two other journalists. Now, of course, these journalists were eventually released, and thankfully Shadi too. And I guess it was also after a massive international outcry and solidarity from around the world. And I'm saying all of this to say, yes, solidarity is key. You know, journalists across our region really have to care about what's happening to other journalists. And Egypt really ranks among the worst jailer of journalists in the world. In CPJ's prison census of jailed journalists last year, for example, it was actually the worst jailer of journalists in Africa. And this has been the case, unfortunately, for several years. And the repression actually continues to this day. And yet, for a short while in 2011, there was hope. You know, you had the so-called Arab Spring protests in Tunisia and elsewhere, and thousands of Egyptians took to the streets in a massive public uprising against poverty, about corruption and repression. And it was, you know, 18 days that eventually saw Egypt's then longtime dictator, Hosni Mubarak, being overthrown. And then we saw a democratically elected president coming into power, but he soon lost, I guess, the support of residents, of citizens who then went to the streets again. And then you saw him, and his name was Mohamed Morsi, you saw him being overthrown by the military amid protests against his rule. And then this heralded the ascendancy of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, a military general who was elected president a year later and really continues ruling Egypt with an iron fist. Now, Sharif is the one who's going to discuss the relationship between the media and the protest paradigm that many media scholars have actually written about. And what do we mean by the protest paradigm? You know, often you find that there's a tendency from the media to favor the status quo, right, in their reporting. And they'll favor it over the social movements. And so I think we're going to hear about how we can change this, how when one covers protests, we don't lose the opportunity to look further than what the police, what the government wants us to hear, and to actually give those who are protesting a platform for their concerns to be raised. So thank you very much, Sharif, over to you.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Angela. I've been based in Egypt, as Angela mentioned, since January 2011, when the revolution broke out on the streets. And in the years since then, and particularly after 2013, we've seen a much more aggressive order take over in Egypt under the command of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, which has largely succeeded in quashing all forms of street mobilization, as well as any and all voices of opposition for the past several years. So this poses a challenge when we're on a panel titled Reporting and Investigating Protests, and we're in a context where there's hardly any protests happening, except for a few sporadic instances. But given that, I'd like to approach this discussion in two parts. First is to discuss covering protests as they manifested on the streets across the country in 2011 and for a couple of years afterwards. And secondly, by looking at the situation now and how different forms of protest, dissent and opposition manifest in a context when street mobilization is largely not possible. So going back to 2011 until about 2013-14, there was a mass protest movement that was vigorous and sustained. And there were marches, sit-ins, factory strikes, takeover of public spaces, street art, and much more. But what I'd like to do is to address some of the potential pitfalls in coverage of that period. So one important takeaway is to understand that street protests can be, for obvious reasons, an enticing story to cover as a journalist. They're conducive to the spectacle and the spectacular. And aside from certain obvious dangers of the kind that Halima outlined, they can be thought of as relatively easy to cover journalistically in a content perspective. After all, the stories happening all around you. However, it's important to keep in mind that the protests and social movements don't happen in a vacuum. They can often seem spontaneous, but they're usually the manifestation of years of groundwork, organizing, and movement building. So in Egypt, the 2011 revolution was really the culmination of 10 years, a decade of organizing and movement building, starting with solidarity protests in Tahrir and elsewhere in the beginning, mostly over international causes. So such as the Second Intifada in Palestine, the mass anti-war protests in the run-up to the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. This then began to develop into local political opposition movements growing, things like campaigns against police torture, over 2 million workers going on wildcat strikes over those 10 years. So in covering protests and things like the 2011 revolution, the context is very important. This was not a Facebook revolution or a Twitter revolution, as was sometimes termed at the time in the mainstream media, but really a mass movement that was the culmination of factors in an important historical context. Another issue to be wary of, and what we saw here, is what can sometimes be characterized as parachute journalism. And this is the tendency of foreign correspondents to arrive on the scene when mass protests break out, and then go on to explain what's happening to their audiences from what is essentially an outside point of view. And no doubt, many foreign correspondents are extremely talented and informed, and they do a great job. But the lack of continued presence in a place or the inability to communicate in the local language often manifests in a lack of nuance in coverage. And one common example of this tendency is to generalize about who the protesters are and to lump them all into one category. They can be unified in a demand that they're all out in the streets for, while at the same time having completely different grievances and motivations. And we really saw this play out in Egypt into the run-up to the coup that ousted President Mohamed Morsi in 2013. The opposition to Morsi grew throughout his 1 year in office, and culminated in this massive protest on June 30th of 2013. But his opponents included a broad swath of political and social movements that included revolutionary activists, labor unions, human rights advocates, but it also included the Coptic Church, intransigent state institutions, former Mubarak regime members, sideline business elites, and political opposition parties. So these groups were actually characterized by conflicting ideologies and grievances. 3 days after that massive protest, Morsi was ousted in a coup that was led by Sisi. And then a fierce and bloody crackdown ensued, first targeting mostly the Muslim Brotherhood, and then everyone else. But there was a very strong tendency in the coverage at the time to lump everyone who opposed Morsi as being a Sisi supporter. And this, in my opinion, was a facile form of journalism that missed a lot of important nuances and differences. Another area I think we need to consider is how the media covers violence by protesters. I think there can be a tendency to more quickly condemn or vilify in the narrative of the media any form of violent physical resistance when it comes by protesters as opposed to the state. What I mean to say is the media can can sometimes portray a protest as somehow less legitimate if it engages in various forms of physical resistance, even though the violence often deployed by protesters is often far less severe when compared to the state. So, it's usually things like rocks and Molotov cocktails versus guns and tanks and tear gas. And the Egyptian revolution, especially in the 18 days in 2011 that overthrew Hosni Mubarak, were often portrayed as peaceful. And there's a degree of truth to that. This was not an armed struggle by any means. But at the same time, nearly 100 police stations were burned to the ground as an attack on the much despised Ministry of Interior. And this was rarely mentioned in the coverage. It was portrayed as a peaceful movement, even though this was an important part of the story, not only for what it says about the protest movement, but also for the tactics it deployed in order to win the streets from the police. So we have to be wary, I think, as journalists about the lens through which we cover things and make sure we're not sanitizing or vilifying certain actors, depending on how much power they have in the political equation. And finally, when we're talking about covering protests and social movements, there can be a tendency to have fixed ideas about what the ultimate goals should be. And I think we often see this when journalists from the global north are covering movements in the global south. There can be a tendency to automatically think that the ultimate aim is to achieve a liberal democracy of the type we see in Europe, for example, and not to seriously consider frameworks that are outside of traditional ideas of liberation. And often these alternative frameworks are dismissed in media coverage as naive or unserious. So for example, the Egyptian revolution had many ideas that included elements of anarchism, socialism, and so forth. Yet the media often restricted its focus on the formal process of elections and the transition process, while ignoring very real on-the-ground organizing efforts to build alternative political forms. And at its worst, this kind of coverage can come off as patronizing. There was a famous, I forgot whether it was Time or Newsweek, they had a cover that had a headline saying something like Egyptians, world's best protesters, world's worst Democrats. So these are just kind of some of the potential pitfalls the media can engage in when covering protests, as at least we witnessed during the Egyptian revolution. But as I explained earlier, since 2013, there's been a severe crackdown on any and all forms of opposition. We're at a point now where street protests, while they do sometimes occur, have largely been eradicated as a popular form of political expression. The cost is extremely high and usually results in mass arrest campaigns that result in years in prison and pretrial detention for those who take part. That's not to say that social movements do not exist in Egypt. They most certainly do. We just have to look at what these other forms of resistance and expression are taking place at the moment. So one of the obvious spaces that this is happening is on social media and other online forums. The internet in Egypt has become one of the last spaces where people can speak out, can voice their opposition, can organize campaigns and petition for change. And in this context, there's still a high degree of protest in the form of online speech. People regularly take to social media to criticize the government, to document abuse, and to rally support for various causes. In parallel with this, the state has also worked to increasingly police the online space. They've acquired surveillance tools to monitor and crack down on online activity. And one of the clearest forms of this is that the Egyptian authorities have blocked over 500 websites in Egypt. The media outlet I work for, Madam, has been blocked since 2017. And while we put up mirror links to bypass the block, it's been quite disruptive to how we publish our content. Many other sites like Human Rights Watch and Jazeera are also blocked. And this is mostly done using technology acquired from a Canadian company called Sandvine. More directly, however, authorities have taken to imprisoning people for their online speech. There are countless activists, lawyers, journalists, and others who are being held in prison in pretrial detention on charges that include publishing false news. I think Egypt has more journalists in prison on false news charges than almost any other country in the world. And this comes, as Angela was mentioning, amid a severe crackdown on the media in Egypt. It's one of the worst jailers of journalists in the world. And it's also a crackdown that's extended beyond the media, targeting human rights organizations, civil society in general. And when operating in such a hostile paradigm, the very act of existence as an independent media outlet or a human rights organization is in itself an act of resistance. By continuing to publish and document when there are very few voices left, these organizations can act as both as a stubborn refusal to be silenced, to give voice to marginalized communities and monitor the powerful, and they act as spaces of community. The events and gatherings they organize, such as screenings or discussions or parties, even if not formally political, act as political gathering spaces nonetheless, precisely because they're among the few spaces that like-minded people can gather together, whether in person or online. That's not to say independent outlets such as ours should act in a vainglorious manner. What I mean is that it's important to understand the role these kinds of places play as political convergence points and places of community outside of the outputs that they produce. And finally, while I mentioned that street protests have largely been suppressed, that's not to say they've been eradicated. We still do see moments of mobilization where anger erupts to such a degree that people are willing to risk looking to the streets. We see this happening in marginalized communities facing evictions and house demolitions, in factories where workers still strike, and sometimes, though rarely, in the city center and on the streets. And we saw that happen in September 2019, when small but significant protests erupted over exposés of government corruption. But the response by the state was to embark on the largest arrest sweep since President Sisi took office, with something like 4,000 people being arrested. So just to close, the subject of this panel, reporting, investigating protests, I think is a very crucial one, because protests are the forms of dissent that come when people are willing to risk not just their voices, but their very bodies to resist various forms of authority, to place their bodies in opposition to power and use their bodies as instruments of liberation. And our role as journalists is crucial to make these voices heard and to make these bodies visible. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sharif. I think let's move into the questions, because something, as you concluded, it made me think, when we were preparing for this, we received an overview of the panel. And I think there was one paragraph that really stood out for me, and that was under outcomes. And I'm going to quote this because it's going to be relevant to the question I'm asking you. It said, one of the outcomes was a model of understanding protests and specific suggestions for improving press coverage. And this is now my emphasis, to enhance the dynamic and outcomes of social movements. And I must say, it actually gave me food for thought. I mean, I thought twice about, what are we saying here? What should be the media's role when it's covering protests? So I guess what I really wanted to ask you, Sharif, is, how do notions of objectivity for journalists come into play when covering protests?
Well, I think, this is obviously a very large question. I'm sorry if there's background noise, but there's a school and they have like military style guy on a mic. Anyway, this question of objectivity in journalism is obviously one that's a massive debate that we see, and whether a journalist should voice their political opinions or not. I think everyone has their biases and everyone has their subjectivity. And the only question is whether you announce those biases and you announce your own political views, or you don't. I don't think there's a better kind of journalism than the other. Good journalism relies on reporting the facts, telling people how you know what you know, and evidence-based data. We often see, I think, people, journalists in general, in mainstream media, who claim to be objective, often have very strong biases towards institutional orthodoxies, and have kind of nationalist ideas when they're covering especially war and things like that. You really see that play out. What is interesting is that when journalists of that ilk are covering protests and they're on the side of the protesters and they're part of the violence that they receive by the state, and they see what's happening on the ground, that usually actually manifests in good coverage, because those biases tend to fall away. So I think, covering kind of mass mobilizations and social movements as they manifest on the ground is kind of the most visceral way journalists can confront certain biases when they're reporting them. So yeah, I think this is something for example, when I go on the air, or if you look at my coverage of 2011, I don't think it was very hard to know where my sympathies lay. I did not a fan of her that engage in so-called violence while the protest movement says this and the Mubarak regime says this. There was a massive social movement working against a 30-year autocrat. And I think that's fine to say things like that, and actually more honest in some ways. So I know there's a lot of nuances in all of this, but I think these are things we need to constantly interrogate ourselves as people who cover these issues.
I'm unmuting myself. You'd think that by now we'd all know when to unmute, but yeah. Just to follow up. So we spoke about the environment that journalists are operating in Egypt, and particularly now it's become increasingly hostile. So what is the role of journalism in such a paradigm?
Well, I'm speaking to you from the offices of Madam Masr right now. And as I mentioned before, I think when there is such a vicious crackdown on the media, that these spaces become actually convergence points of a political gathering in certain ways. We're one of the few organizations that's independent, that's been for various reasons, and a lot of those reasons are because of international solidarity, actually, that we're still existing. And so they're one of the few spaces where actually people who have been kicked out of other spaces can meet. And so whenever we hold certain types of gatherings or discussions that have nothing to do with, the formal political process, these are ways people can gather, but in a more kind of direct way. So some of the things that Halima was talking about, the media is seen as such an enemy now that it's whenever we're on the street, it's very hard to do journalism on the street, actually. You have to, whereas before at some points and in different contexts around the world, your announcement that you're a journalist protects you. Here, it makes you the enemy. And so from very simple things like we don't even use notepads, we use our phones to take notes, because pulling out a notepad or a mic, or we don't never use radio mics, we use our phones because it looks more innocuous. So there's the practicalities of it, but there's also questions that are then imposed on us as journalists and editors about how far we can push the line. So as you mentioned, we were raided in this office 2 years ago by state security agents who are kind of like the political tip of the spear of the police force. And it really shook up the organization. It was the first time. We always thought this was a safe space. Whenever there was dangers, we would actually come here. And they invaded and took over our space within a matter of minutes. Shadi had been arrested and blindfolded and held for a day and a half. And when they took Lina and 2 other journalists from here, we thought we'd never see them again. Fortunately, because of the international solidarity, they were released. But then it made us really confront, okay, so say we have then a story that we know is going to upset them. And they raided us after we wrote a story about Sisi's son. And we made a very clear decision then and there that if we ever held back because of the dangers, then we should just close down, actually. Because if we have a story that is in the public interest, that is well sourced, and we don't publish it, then we have stopped practicing journalism. Obviously, there's ways in which we go around things, and we're always using anonymous sources because no one will speak to us unless they go anonymous. But I think that key decision was important, because if we do have a story that we know is well sourced and is in the public interest, and we don't publish it because we think it's a danger to ourselves, then we're better off shutting down because we've kind of stopped practicing the essential role of the media.
Thank you. I think we've got about, if we want to stick to time, I know we started late, but we've got about 21 minutes. So please, again, if anyone has questions, please either put it here on Zoom in the chat or on the app, on the Wova app. So let me turn to Azzarah. I think if we look at so many journalists operating on our continent, you know, they don't have the might of a news organization like News 24 behind them with the sort of resources that your media company may have. So I think the question really is, can we use open source software, you know, to create graphics and use data like you did on your own, when you don't have a graphics designer, when you don't have someone who is doing data journalism? I mean, how do you go about doing this? Is it feasible? Can someone who is a freelancer operating without much able to do what you did?
Well, from I mean, we've known the experiences of African journalists in reporting protests, and the environment that I operate in. I do work for quite a big news company in South Africa with a lot of resources, but I also operate in an environment that isn't as oppressive as what we've just heard Halima and Sharif speak about. Not nearly that oppressive. And so if Sharif is talking about government putting bans on certain websites and social media and you know, access to that type of information, using open source data is actually just impossible. And then in that case, you would have to rely on real people, which again is probably not possible in that context. But that being said, there are, in fact, the map that I just showed you was done on an open source tool, and it's, you know, it's relatively quite easy to use. And you know, I'm not trained in any data like expertise. It's really just knowing what you want to do and what your end product, what you want that to look like, and then gathering that relevant data from the sources that are available to you. I must say that when I was gathering my data, I tried to use official sources, and I tried to go to the police and all my contacts in the police and the spokespeople, and I said, can we collaborate on this project that I'm doing? Because I think it's going to give, you know, a really good context to what's going on, and it could even possibly help you. But like all over South Africa, our police are, I mean, I would go, you know, so far as to say that they are quite a hindrance to press freedom. So they were tight-lipped. They said absolutely not. I still don't understand why, but the fact that I could even approach them is a completely different environment in itself. But open source tools do exist, and sources of information are out there. But in an environment where certain websites are banned, where certain sources, you can't access them freely, no, you can't, honestly. The resources especially are not there.
If, of course, you are able to use open source information, I think the one question one needs to ask is then, how do you interrogate the veracity? You know?
Yeah. So when I was looking at location data, my main data source was the sources that were speaking to our journalists, and the data that the Institute for Security Services gave me, which I trust. But then using social media was not so much to look at geolocation data, but to look at timestamps. And I was never going to get it 100% accurate, because I was never going to see when exactly the first truck drove onto the N3 in KZN. So it really, I knew that I wasn't looking for something that is 100% accurate in terms of time. I just needed a very rough time in order to sequence a rough chronology. But even then, I did try to weigh that against what our sources were telling us and what official news reports were saying, to see, if it was roughly correct.
So you talked about the police not being very cooperative, so how can one work actually with independent institutions? I know you mentioned the ISS, so that you can acquire reliable information. How do you go about that?
Yeah, no, the police are not going to be your friend in any situation. In fact, yeah, it was quite difficult, the whole sort of July unrest, to speak to the police. And you'll see that much of our reporting does come from security experts and policing experts and even anti-terrorism experts. And in South Africa, these institutions like you'll get the ISS. There's a few others. I can't think of them now, but they are extremely accessible, Angela. Like it's actually quite a privilege to work in this kind of environment, because they are extremely accessible. You can just call them up. They have websites where you can email and say, look, I'm looking for this expert. Is there somebody like this in your institution? And they'll say, yes, here's this person's phone number and email address, and just plan with them when you want to speak. So it's an incredible privilege to work with those institutions and to have access to that sort of expertise, especially, just as a side note, during COVID, we have access to so many scientists as well. We just call them. And even in that situation, they are more accessible than government, who actually should be transparent, and you should be able to get your questions answered from them, but you just don't. So you need to rely on independent experts, which again is a privilege to have.
And just a last question from me to you then. I'm interested in, how did your readers respond? I mean, was there this engagement, or did you feel that you had done all this work and it just went into the ether? Or did you find that people were actually playing around with that map, checking things? Were you able to track how that information that you used is put out there? Yeah.
Yes, it got a really great reception. I got a few emails from people who were doing studies on the July unrest, asking me because I write for investigations, and most of our stories are published behind the paywall. So I got a lot of messages from people who are trying to study the July violence, asking me if I could send them a free copy, which I did. So it was it was a really lovely reception. And obviously, for the purposes of study, or if you're writing about someone, that's you send them the free version.
Right.
I think it gave people some empirical analysis of what had taken place. And yeah, it got a great reception, a lot of comments on, but how comments can be, but a lot of comments on the Zuma issue in general. But also, I think what was more important is that it told South Africa that this fell apart. These people are not as strong as we think they are. Outside of KZN, beyond KZN, their influence shatters. And so I think that was the most important message that our readers picked up.
Okay, thank you very much. So Halima, I'd be interested in your assessment of how journalists actually do cover protest in Uganda. Do you find that the coverage is actually skewed towards the status quo? I mean, are they focusing on the narrative by police and official sources, or do you find that journalists are actually going beyond what is there facing them, and that they dig in to try and ensure that they actually get the facts, that it's not only what the police may be saying, but what the protesters are actually protesting about.
So Angela, I think many times in Uganda, I mean, just like Sharif did mention, that when a protest is happening, it comes after months of preparations, and then there's also the aftermath, of what happens. So yes, many journalists will go and cover exactly what they see, report exactly what they see and what's going on, speak to both the state and the protesters. But the way I think for me, in my opinion, I think there's just always more to these protests. More than just what's happened on that day. And I'll give you an example. A little after the election, there were so many pickups of people, police went, or security went identifying different people, and so many people were reporting missing persons, family members were missing. And there was this press conference that we went to, and the head of police was speaking. I attended that police presser, and I'll be honest, I was quite angry. I'm sorry, like Sharif said, sometimes you can't help but express, which side you're on or who you're sympathizing with. And I felt like there were so many people who had reported their family members missing. And when I first raised the question and said, but there are people missing, is the police the one responsible for picking up these people? And then the head of police looks at me and says, can you please ensure that you give me the names of the people, where they were picked up, who picked them up, who did what? And I was like, that is not my job as a journalist. I am telling you, people have been picked. Luckily, I had a source, and I quickly texted them and said, can you share the names of the people? And immediately my source shared the names of the people and the places where they were picked up from. And this press conference had the head of CID, they had almost every department of police at the time. So when I read the names of the people who had been arrested and the places where they'd been picked up, the head of CID goes and says, yeah, I can identify 2 names on that list. There's actually a report that has been, and I'm like, so why were you not agreeing to this? But and the head of police kept laughing. And I remember the person who tried to quell the mood was the Minister for Internal Affairs, because I again stood up and said, is it possible for some members who were addressing us to just be serious about the issue that we are discussing? Because these are family members. Tomorrow, it could be a member of your family. You just do not laugh over these issues. And then the police have said, who is laughing? Who is? And I was like, Honorable, I mean, I told him, IGP, you are laughing over a matter where people are actually crying about their family members. So as a journalist, you find that, you are covering these stories. Yes, you're going to speak to the police, but also remember, many times we are basically depending on the police. Like Azzarah has mentioned, we always have to depend on them. So they have their line of discussion. For example, take an example right now with all these bombings that are happening in the country. First they said, yes, they're blaming it on the ADF, the Allied Democratic Forces. And now the UPDF has gone ahead to deploy in DRC. What are we doing? Every time we're writing stories, we're basically depending on official sources. I have to call the spokesperson for the UPDF. I have to call the DRC spokesperson, government spokesperson. What kind of information am I giving out? Do I have even the privilege of speaking to someone who is a member of the ADF? Right now, we know no one is going to come out and speak about that. But that is our job as journalists, to go and find these people, speak to them. One of the stories that I think got published by both Voice of America and the Washington Post for me was during the post-elections was I went and spoke to a number of people who had been picked up, and they talk about how they had been tortured, places that had been taken to, how they were arrested, being blindfolded, being picked up during daytime. So for us as journalists, I think we need to go beyond what we see that is in the open. We need to tell a story. We need to go back and speak to these people. Right now we cannot talk to so-called members of the ADF families because they are also living in fear. When you wake up in the morning and maybe your husband or your father has been arrested, and before you know it, you hear they've been shot at. I mean, their
Yeah.
wives who are also getting arrested, they're not going to speak to you, but maybe later, these are stories that we still need to go back and explore just beyond what we're being given as the state line of talk at the moment.
So Halima, one of the things that I heard you speaking about when you were saying, you know, that press conference where you were actually challenging, and rightly so, those officials who were talking to you, you know, if I remember that VOA article of yours that I mentioned ahead of Press Freedom Day, you actually spoke about the relations with, I think, the Defense Force, if it was, and there was this line about how somehow the Defense Force leadership decided that they needed to arrange a soccer match, right, to improve relations with the media. And I must say, I was pleased to see that the media and media owners actually beat the military. But, you know, I mean, have relations actually improved? Or
well,
do you?
We always say here in Uganda that they're only nice to us when they want. You know, we were lucky that we actually beat them during that match, and I actually also attended the match. But when we get out to the field, they still beat us, and there's no stopping, because you know the police and the army always come out to say they are professional, and you know we have to respect each other when we get out to the field. But I don't know where the message goes. You know, and many times, because when after all these beatings, when we go and confront them, we are confronting their leaders. So the question always is, when the front soldiers are sent to the field to quell these protests, to quell these riots, what is it that they are told about journalists? We do not know. You know, what kind of message are they given? Do you go out and beat everyone, including a journalist or anyone who is coming to cover up? We still do not know. So we can never tell. We do not know what's going to happen the next day, you know, if something comes up and the police come and say, but then I think through conversations that many journalists come out to say, the ones that they have off the record with some of these security officers, is that the order is always one: hit whoever comes your way. So it probably is never going to be safe for journalists. So we just need to look out for ourselves. We need to prepare. We need to know what we're getting ourselves into every time we get out to cover these protests.
I think the one thing, Sharif, as we wrap up, because we are running out of time, when the state, and because this is happening in Uganda, happens elsewhere on the continent, obviously in Egypt, when the state actually clamps down on all voices of opposition or organizing, you know, how should journalists then cover social movements that can be more hidden, I guess, from view? How would you go about that? What can they do?
Yeah, I mean, this is something we confront constantly here in Egypt, is to find kind of where are these hidden ways of contentious politics that still exist? And they very much do. And it often happens in marginalized communities. At least here, there are very rapid and quite in a form of violence, these urban changes that are happening to the city, and people are being evicted. Entire neighborhoods are being evicted. People have had to dig up across historic graveyards bodies of their relatives and move them to other graveyards because a highway is coming through. And this has actually sparked quite robust opposition from residents, either people going into the streets or organizing online, and actually sometimes succeeding in diverting some of these national projects. So there are these spaces, pockets that are outside of formal politics in some way, that are engaged in these various forms of contentious politics. And actually, in Northern Sinai, where journalists have been banned for about 7 years now, where you can't get in there to cover because there's a low-level insurgency that has waged there between militants and the army and security forces, with the civilian population trapped in between both. They are organizing against the control of their lives, with roadblocks everywhere, with them being both arrested by the state security forces and being killed by militants. And you know, we have a reporter who's from northern Sinai from Arish, who reports for us, and we're one of the few places that's able to put out news from there. So it takes, I think, it's a little harder to look for these spaces, but they're constantly happening around us. And I think it's important, especially in these contexts, it's more important to bring them to light.
Thanks, Sharif. Well, we've got about a minute to go before the session ends. So let me just say that obviously we've got to thank our panel. I mean, it's really been interesting, and I'm sorry again that we started late and we weren't able to hear more and to ask more questions. I also wanted to say that, you know, we have provided some links to reading material that I really urge you to read and if you have a chance. Sharif, I know you also have some ideas of what our audience can read. So please, if you'd like to send it to Irene and she can post it on the app, sure. Right? The other thing, and this is where I use the fact that I'm working for CPJ, just to tell everyone that this week on December the 9th, we're actually going to be releasing our annual census of journalists jailed around the world and also of journalists who have been killed. And so if you do want an embargoed copy of that, please just reach out to me either via app or through the organizers, and I'll try and get that to you. You can also request that at press@cpj.org. I can tell you that obviously it's not pretty reading. It's something that I really hope that people will report on, simply because I think that it's not something that we should be ignoring as journalists. We saw how solidarity was so important for Madamas when they were being raided, when their journalists were being arrested. And I think when you have that sort of attention from journalists themselves, then you also have others who are going to care about what's happening. So thank you for that. Thank you to the organizers. I wish you all well. I hope that the conference will go well and that you will learn a lot over the next few days. And so from me, in a rather chilly New York, goodbye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angela.